Dr. Margaret Henley adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully lifted the sepia-toned photograph from the estate sale box, the musty smell of decades-old memories filling her nostrils. The afternoon light, filtering through the diamond-paned windows of Ashcroft Manor, revealed a wedding scene from 1922, a bride in ivory lace beaming beside her groom outside what appeared to be St. Mary's Church in Lower Slaughter. The wedding party looked radiant, filled with the post-war optimism that had defined the early 20s, when couples rushed to marry after the devastating losses of 1914-1918. Another lovely piece for the village. Historical society, Margaret murmured to herself, her trained historian's eye already cataloging details. The bride's dropped waist dress typical of the period, the groom's morning coat, the handful of guests dressed in their Sunday finest. She turned the photograph over to read the faded inscription written in careful copperplate. Edward and Rose Whitmore, June 15th, 1922. A new beginning. But as she examined the image more closely under the lamplight, something deeply unsettling caught her attention. While Rose's face absolutely glowed with unmistakable joy, her dark eyes sparkling with happiness and her smile genuine and radiant, her new husband Edward's expression seemed disturbingly hollow, almost vacant. His smile appeared painfully forced, mechanical, as if he were merely going through the motions of happiness. Most troubling of all were his eyes. They held a darkness, an emptiness that seemed completely at odds with what should have been the happiest day of his life. Margaret had spent 30 years as a historian specializing in post-Great War Britain, examining thousands of photographs from that transformative era. She'd seen countless wedding photographs from those hopeful years, when survivors sought to rebuild their lives and find happiness after unimaginable loss. But there was something about Edward Whitmore's expression that made her pause, made her skin crawl with inexplicable dread. This wasn't just melancholy or war weariness. It was something far more troubling, something that seemed to whisper of secrets buried deep. 3 days later, Margaret found herself in the archives of the Gloucestershire County Council, surrounded by towering stacks of dusty ledgers, marriage certificates, and local records that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The building's heating system rattled and wheezed as she worked, the autumn chill seeping through the old windows as she searched methodically through the files. The Whitmore name had proven surprisingly elusive in the local records, appearing in scattered references, but never with the detailed documentation she'd expected for a family that had clearly been well-to-do. "Ah, here we are," she whispered triumphantly, finally locating the marriage certificate, buried in a misfiled folder. Edward James Whitmore, age 28, his occupation listed as gentleman farmer, married to Rose Catherine Mills, age 24, spinster. The witnesses were listed as Thomas Mills, presumably Rose's father, and someone intriguingly named Captain Henry Blackwood. Military titles often led to more detailed service records, and Captain Blackwood might provide crucial information about Edward's mysterious background and his experiences during the war. Margaret's pulse quickened with anticipation as she photographed the document with her digital camera. Something about this case was drawing her in deeper than usual, a nagging sense that the photograph was trying to tell her something important, something that had been overlooked for nearly a century. At the village library later that afternoon, she arranged to meet with Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, the elderly librarian whose family had lived in the area for over 4 generations. Mrs. Ashford's grandmother had been alive during the 1920s and might remember local gossip about the Whitmore family. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice immediately dropping to a conspiratorial whisper when Margaret showed her the wedding photograph. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she held the image closer to her thick spectacles. "I remember my grandmother speaking of the Whitmores quite often. Tragic family, really. Absolutely tragic. Edward inherited Ashford Manor after his father died, suddenly in 1920, but there were always whispers in the village, always rumors." "What sort of whispers?" Margaret asked, leaning forward with growing interest. That Edward had come back from France fundamentally different, changed in ways that went far beyond what we now call shell shock. "My grandmother was very specific about it," Mrs. Ashford continued, settling more comfortably in her chair as memories surfaced. "She said Edward Whitmore had married poor Rose under completely false pretenses, though she never fully explained what she meant by that. But I remember her saying that the young man who'd gone off to war in 1917 bore little resemblance to the man who'd returned and taken up residence at the manor house." Margaret studied the photograph again with this new information, Rose's radiant smile now seeming tinged with a heartbreaking innocence that made her chest tighten with sympathy. What had this vibrant young woman unknowingly walked into on what should have been the most joyful day of her life? There were other things too, Mrs. Ashford added, her voice growing even quieter. Disappearances in the area, young women mostly. Servants who'd left their positions without notice. Shopgirls who'd simply vanished without a trace. The local constabulary always seemed to have perfectly reasonable explanations. Girls running off to London or eloping with sweethearts. But my grandmother was convinced something more sinister was happening. She paused to sip her tea, her hands still trembling slightly. And then there was Rose herself. Grandmother said she'd seen her in the village market just a few months after the wedding, looking absolutely terrified, pale as a ghost, jumping at shadows. When Grandmother tried to speak with her, Rose just hurried away without a word. A few weeks later, Edward announced that his wife had gone to visit relatives in Scotland. She was never seen in the village again. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, despite the library's warm atmosphere. Did anyone ever investigate these disappearances? Oh, there were questions asked, certainly. But Edward Whitmore was a war hero, you see, from a well-respected family with considerable influence in the county. People were reluctant to think ill of him, especially given what he'd supposedly endured in France. And whenever official inquiries were made, they seemed to mysteriously lose momentum or be quietly dropped. The elderly librarian leaned closer, her eyes bright with the excitement of sharing long-held secrets. But Grandmother never forgot, never stopped watching and wondering. She kept a record, written in the margins of her prayer book. Names, dates, circumstances. I've still got that prayer book at home. The following morning, Margaret sat in Mrs. Ashford's cozy sitting room, carefully examining the weathered prayer book that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, Sarah Ashford. The margins were indeed filled with meticulous notations written in faded ink, documenting disappearances and suspicious circumstances spanning from 1919 to 1924. Sarah had been remarkably thorough, recording not just names and dates, but also personal details about each missing woman, their ages, their families, their last known whereabouts. Look here. Eleanor pointed to a particularly dense section of annotations. Grandmother wrote about Mary Fletcher, age 19, housemaid at the Pemberton estate, disappeared in August 1920, just 2 months after Edward returned from his supposed convalescence in Switzerland. The official story was that she'd stolen some jewelry and fled to avoid prosecution. But Grandmother knew the girl's family well. Mary was devoutly religious, wouldn't have stolen so much as a penny. Margaret photographed each page carefully, her historian's training recognizing the value of contemporaneous documentation. Sarah Ashford had essentially created an unofficial police investigation, complete with witness statements and timeline correlations. And here, Eleanor continued, turning to another marked page, is what Grandmother wrote about Agnes Morrison, the baker's daughter. 22 years old, engaged to be married to the blacksmith's son. Found her bicycle abandoned on the road that leads past Whitmore Manor, but Agnes herself was never found. Her fiancé searched for weeks, convinced something terrible had happened to her. Well, the pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Young women, typically between 18 and 25, all disappearing after being seen in the vicinity of Edward Whitmore's property. The official explanations varied. Some had supposedly run away, others had allegedly left to seek work in larger cities, but the consistent thread was that none had ever been heard from again. Grandmother's final entry about Rose is particularly heartbreaking, Eleanor said, her voice heavy with emotion. She wrote, "That poor child married a monster. God help her soul. I've seen the fear in her eyes, the way she flinches when he touches her. Mark my words, Rose Whitmore will not see Christmas." Rose disappeared in October 1922, just as Grandmother had predicted. Margaret closed the prayer book with trembling hands, feeling the weight of nearly century-old evidence that might finally provide answers to questions no one had dared ask. Margaret's next breakthrough came at the National Army Museum in London, where she'd arranged to research Captain Henry Blackwood's service record. The Victorian building's reading room was quiet except for the soft scratching of pencils and the occasional rustle of turning pages as she worked through military personnel files dating from the Great War. Captain Blackwood's record revealed that he had served alongside Edward Whitmore in the 2nd Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment, during the final, desperate months of the war. But it was a collection of personal papers, donated to the museum by Blackwood's family in the 1960s, that provided the most startling revelations. Tucked away in a folder marked Private Correspondence was a series of letters that Blackwood had written to his wife between 1922 and 1925. The letters painted a picture of a man increasingly tormented by knowledge he felt unable to share. "My dearest Margaret," one letter began, dated July 1922, just 1 month after Edward's wedding. "I fear I have made a terrible mistake in agreeing to stand as witness to Edward's marriage to that sweet girl Rose. What I discovered about his experiences in France continues to haunt my sleep and disturb my waking hours. The Edward who returned to England is fundamentally not the same man who left us in 1917. Rose deserves to know the truth about what she has married, but the oath of secrecy I took regarding certain wartime operations binds my tongue and prevents me from warning her." The letter continued with increasing desperation. "I have tried to approach the matter obliquely, inviting myself to dinner at their home, observing Edward's behavior, looking for ways to protect Rose without breaking my military oath. But Edward seems to sense my suspicions, and I fear that my presence may actually be putting Rose in greater danger. There is something predatory in the way he watches her, something calculating and cold that makes my blood run cold." Margaret's hands were shaking as she photographed each page. The letter ended abruptly, as if Captain Blackwood had thought better of continuing his written confession. A later letter dated September 1922 was even more disturbing. Edward came to see me today, ostensibly a social call between old comrades. But there was a threat implicit in everything he said, a reminder of what we both experienced in France and what would happen if I violated my oath of silence. He knows that I know, and I believe he was warning me to remain quiet. God forgive me, but I think I am going to honor that warning, even if it costs Rose her life. Margaret's research into the Gloucestershire Regiment's final campaigns led her to recently declassified documents held at the National Archives in Kew. The process of accessing classified military records was lengthy and bureaucratic, requiring special permissions and security clearances, but her academic credentials and research purpose eventually opened the right doors. The file she was looking for was marked Operation Lazarus, a name that made her pulse quicken with anticipation. The operation had been classified at the highest levels for over a century, only recently released under Freedom of Information legislation, with heavy redactions still obscuring many crucial details. According to the documents, Operation Lazarus had been a joint intelligence operation between British forces and French resistance networks in March 1918. 12 volunteers from various British regiments had been selected for a mission deep behind German lines, ostensibly to gather intelligence on enemy troop movements and supply lines in preparation for the final Allied offensive. But as Margaret read deeper into the files, it became clear that the operation had gone catastrophically wrong. The 12 volunteers had been captured within days of crossing into German-held territory, taken prisoner not by regular Wehrmacht units, but by a specialized German psychological warfare division that had been experimenting with advanced interrogation and mental conditioning techniques. Of the 12 men captured during Operation Lazarus, the report stated in clinical bureaucratic language, 11 died in enemy custody. The circumstances of their deaths remain classified. The sole survivor, Private Edward James Whitmore, was recovered during the Allied advance of August 1918, having spent approximately 5 months in German custody. The file contained a medical evaluation conducted immediately after Edward's recovery. Private Whitmore presents with significant psychological alterations consistent with prolonged exposure to advanced interrogation techniques. His personality? Structure appears to have been systematically deconstructed and rebuilt. While he retains memories of his previous life and identity, his emotional responses and moral reasoning show profound abnormalities. Recommend extended psychiatric observation and potential discharge from active service, but there was a note, appended in different handwriting. Due to acute personnel shortages and Whitmore's apparent functional capacity, subject will be returned to light duties pending further evaluation. His experiences behind enemy lines make him a valuable intelligence asset. Margaret sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Edward Whitmore hadn't simply been a prisoner of war. He had been the subject of systematic psychological experimentation that had fundamentally altered his humanity. Further research into declassified German archives, accessible through international academic databases, revealed the horrifying scope of the psychological warfare program that had captured Edward Whitmore. The German High Command had been experimenting with techniques designed to break down enemy prisoners' personalities and rebuild them as potential assets. Unwitting double agents who could be returned to Allied lines carrying false information or, in extreme cases, programmed to carry out specific missions. The program, codenamed Project Wiedergeburt, Project Rebirth, had been the brainchild of Dr. Klaus Brenner, a psychiatrist who had become convinced that human personality was infinitely malleable under the right conditions. His techniques involved prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, systematic physical and psychological torture, and experimental drugs designed to enhance suggestibility. According to captured German records, the 11 men who had died during the process had been unable to survive the complete psychological breakdown that the treatment required. Their minds had simply shattered under the pressure, leading to catatonia, psychosis, and eventually death. Edward Whitmore, however, had proven remarkably resilient. The German reports, translated into English by Allied intelligence after the war, described him as an ideal subject, whose psychological architecture proved sufficiently robust to withstand complete deconstruction while maintaining basic functional capacity. But the rebuilding process had gone wrong. Instead of creating a controllable asset, Dr. Brenner's experiments had produced something else entirely, a human being who retained all his original memories and abilities but had been stripped of empathy, moral reasoning, and emotional connection to other human beings. The Edward who emerged from 5 months of systematic psychological torture was technically functional but fundamentally inhuman. Margaret found a particularly chilling passage in Dr. Brenner's personal notes. Subject E demonstrates perfect recall of his previous life and relationships, can mimic appropriate emotional responses with remarkable accuracy, and shows no obvious signs of mental instability. However, psychological testing reveals complete absence of genuine emotional attachment to others. He views other human beings as objects to be manipulated or consumed. The process has created what we might term a perfect predator, one who can blend seamlessly into human society while harboring fundamentally anti-human impulses. The final note in Edward's file was dated just days before the German retreat. Subject E will be released near Allied lines during our withdrawal. His conditioning should ensure continued utility as an intelligence asset, though his specific mission parameters remain undefined. He may prove valuable for gathering information about Allied reconstruction efforts after the war. Margaret's investigation took an unexpected turn when she received a call from the Gloucestershire Archives. A recently donated collection of materials from a house clearance had included several items relating to the Mills family, Rose's maiden name. Among these items was a small leather-bound diary that had apparently been hidden in a secret compartment of an antique dressing table. The diary was Rose's, and its entries spanned the period from her engagement to Edward through the final weeks before her disappearance. Reading Rose's own words, written in her careful, educated handwriting, Margaret felt as though she were witnessing a tragedy unfold in real time across the decades. The early entries were filled with the joy and anticipation of a young woman. In love, Edward is everything I dreamed of in a husband. Handsome, well-educated, a war hero who has seen the world and returned with such fascinating stories. Father approves of the match, and I believe we shall be very happy together at Ashford Manor. But even during their engagement, Rose had noticed troubling signs. Sometimes, when Edward looks at me, I have the strangest feeling that he is studying me rather than simply admiring me. It's as if he is cataloging my features, my expressions, my reactions for some purpose I cannot fathom. When I mentioned this to Father, he laughed and said that Edward was merely smitten with my beauty. I hope Father is right. The entries from the weeks immediately following the wedding revealed Rose's growing unease. Edward's behavior has become increasingly strange since our return from our honeymoon in Bath. He disappears for hours during the night, claiming he suffers from insomnia and finds that long walks help him sleep. But when he returns, there is soil under his fingernails and a smell about him that I cannot identify. Earthy and unpleasant, like something that has been buried and dug up again. As the weeks passed, Rose's entries became increasingly frightened. I followed Edward during one of his nighttime wanderings and saw him disappearing into the old section of the manor's cellar that he had told me was unsafe and forbidden. When I tried to follow, I found the door locked from the inside. I waited for over an hour before I heard him returning through the house. When I confronted him the next morning, he became angry, not the normal anger of a husband caught in deception, but something colder and more frightening. He grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks and told me that there were parts of his life that I must never try to understand. Rose's diary entries from September and October 1922 painted a picture of mounting terror as she began to understand what she had married. Margaret found herself reading with tears in her eyes, knowing how the story would end, but hoping against hope that somehow Rose had found a way to escape. September 15th, 1922. I have discovered that Edward has been receiving correspondence from other parts of the country, letters that he burns immediately after reading them. I managed to save one partially burned page from the fireplace, and it contained the most disturbing content. Someone was writing to Edward about the latest acquisition and asking for his assessment of viability. The language was clinical, almost medical, and it made my blood run cold. What kind of correspondence could my husband be conducting in such terms? September 28th, 1922. I am now certain that Edward is not the man I married, or rather, that the man I thought I married never truly existed. Today, I found him in the cellar, despite his repeated warnings that it was unsafe. What I discovered there has shaken me to my very core. There were surgical instruments, glass containers filled with unidentifiable substances, and most horrifying of all, items of women's clothing that clearly did not belong to me. When Edward found me there, his reaction was not anger or embarrassment, it was calculation. He looked at me the way a scientist might look at a laboratory specimen, as if he were determining what to do with me. October 1st, 1922. This will be my final entry. I have discovered the truth about my husband, and I know now that I will not survive much longer in this house. Edward is not a man recovering from the trauma of war. He is something else entirely, something that wears Edward's face but harbors the soul of a monster. I have found evidence of his activities, evidence that I dare not write down for fear that he will discover this diary. I am going to attempt to leave today, to flee to my sister's house in Yorkshire and warn the authorities about what Edward has become. If something happens to me, if I disappear like the other girls from the village, please know that Edward Whitmore killed his wife, and God knows how many others. The real Edward died somewhere in France, and what came back is wearing his skin, but harboring something inhuman underneath. The diary ended there, the final entry smudged as if Rose had written it in great haste. Margaret closed the small book with trembling hands. Knowing that Rose had never made it to Yorkshire, never escaped the manor house, never lived to warn anyone about her husband's true nature, but Rose's courage in documenting the truth had finally provided the evidence needed to expose Edward Whitmore's crimes, nearly a century after they had been committed. Margaret's research culminated in a remarkable discovery at the Yorkshire Police Archive, where she found records of Edward Whitmore's final arrest in 1938. Her investigation had revealed that Edward had continued his pattern of marriage and murder for 16 years after Rose's death, moving from county to county across northern England, each time assuming a slightly different identity while maintaining his core persona as a war hero and gentleman. By 1938, he had married and killed at least 7 more women, each disappearance carefully orchestrated to appear voluntary. But his final victim, a young woman named Catherine Mills, Rose's younger sister, had family who refused to accept the official explanations. Rose's brother James had never believed the story about his sister visiting Scottish relatives. He had spent years quietly investigating, following Edward's trail across the country, documenting his pattern of behavior, building a case that the authorities seemed unwilling to pursue. When Catherine also disappeared after marrying Edward, James finally took matters into his own hands. The police records revealed that James Mills had deliberately gotten himself arrested for a minor offense and placed in the same holding cell as Edward, who had been detained on suspicion of his latest wife's murder. What happened in that cell during the early hours of the morning was recorded in James' confession. I confronted him about Rose, about Catherine, about all the other innocent women he had killed. He didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost proud of what he had accomplished. He told me that the war had shown him what human beings really were underneath their civilized pretenses, and that he had simply been honest about his true nature while others continued to pretend at decency. When I asked him about Rose specifically, he smiled, the same empty smile I remembered from their wedding day. He told me that Rose had been particularly instructive because she had fought so hard to maintain her humanity, even as he systematically stripped it away. He said that watching someone like Rose break down had taught him valuable lessons about the human psyche that he had applied to subsequent victims. At that point, I knew that the legal system would never provide adequate justice for what this creature had done. The authorities had protected him for 20 years, had allowed him to kill again and again, because they were unwilling to confront the truth about what the war had created. I took the broken handle from the cell's wash basin and did what should have been done 20 years ago. The coroner's report confirmed that Edward Whitmore had died from a single penetrating wound to the chest. James Mills was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years in prison, a sentence that he served without complaint, telling anyone who would listen that it was a small price to pay for finally stopping a monster. Margaret's investigation had finally provided the complete picture of a tragedy that had begun in the trenches of France and ended in a Yorkshire jail cell, spanning 2 decades and claiming at least 17 innocent lives. Standing in the rebuilt St. Mary's churchyard in Lower Slaughter, Margaret looked at the new memorial stone she had helped commission, which now honored Rose Whitmore and all the other forgotten victims of her husband's 20-year reign of terror. The original wedding photograph, properly contextualized with the full story of what it represented, had been donated to the Imperial War Museum as part of an exhibition about the long-term psychological consequences of wartime trauma and the importance of supporting veterans' mental health. The empty eyes that had first caught Margaret's attention in that sepia-toned wedding portrait now served a different purpose entirely. Rather than concealing a dark secret, they had become a window into understanding how war can destroy not just bodies, but souls, how trauma can metastasize into evil, and how society's failure to confront uncomfortable truths can enable unspeakable crimes. Rose's story, finally told in full, stood as both a memorial to the victims and a warning about the true costs of turning away from evidence of evil simply because it challenges our comfortable assumptions about heroes and villains, about war and peace, about the nature of humanity itself.